Alrighty, hello my friends. It is a beautiful, beautiful day here in Maine. It is 3 o'clock Eastern time and time to do the podcast. So today's podcast is going to be super amazing. So tune the heck on in because we have lots of stuff that we have to talk about. So we are going to talk about, we're going to continue. So the podcast topic for today is talking about critical control points and critical limits, going on the how to write a HACCP plan theme that we've been doing for several, I guess more than a quarter now. And so we're going to be talking about that. This follows up from the podcast number, and go check, 76. Justifying your decisions in your hazard analysis. So there's a whole set of work that leads up to what we're talking about today. And if you haven't been doing that work, I want you to go back and listen to the podcast. You can catch them on YouTube. You can find them here on the Proofing Box. So join us on the Proofing Box if you haven't and you're not listening to this live, because we started HACCP planning in episode, oh heavens, step 3, episode planning, back on November 14th. The 5 free steps of food safety planning was intro and step 1. So that was way the heck back on the 14th of November. So that's how far back this process goes. So there's time. Obviously, I've done a lot of different things since then, but this is a continuation of the HACCP planning podcast that we have been doing. So today's HACCP planning, or I guess real podcast topic is CCPs and critical limits, which is kind of the point of writing a HACCP plan, right? And then I am doing office hours after this, and we're talking about mobile slaughter. I am probably going to turn that into a mini-sode to get released this weekend, but as we are living through this coronavirus and as I start talking to people and recognizing the sheer volume of response that local food has been able to put into the system, like local food is really stepping up. Local meat processors are completely slammed. Like I have one client where all he's doing is producing bacon. I have other clients who just can't kill anything fast enough. And so I've had a ton of people this week, actually, now that we're sort of looking at this new normal, and we've seen the closures of the JBS and the Cargill plants and things like that, want to talk to me about slaughter and processing and that sort of thing. And so that's what we're going to talk about in office hours today. Other news and notes, we did a really great webinar yesterday on approved supplier programs. Those are only archived on the Proofing Box page. So if you missed that, it's archived on the Proofing Box page. Come watch that. We've actually had a ton of people already watch that. And if you are interested in taking that work further, of course, I do run a business, guys, and you can certainly get in touch with me. I've had a ton of people booking consult calls, and those are the calls by which you get on the phone with me and we make a ton of decisions about not only what are you doing out in the world, but whether or not I'm the right person to help you. And which resources would be the right ones for you, because we do have a lot here at Dirigo Food Safety. And so I just want to make you aware of that. So you can always book a blueprint call, and that's like, I don't know, that's pinned to it's really easy to find, or you just DM me or find me. I'm not going searching for you. It's pretty obvious how to do that. And so that's what we've got. And I would like to reiterate my offer to veterans, coming into the power group and getting into our system and working with me is actually priced at pay what you think it is worth. Okay, and I'm really dead serious about that. I know what it's worth, and I was talking with one of my very favorite veterans this morning, and the sheer amount of brain space that he has saved by working with me has allowed him to really solidify his business in a time where local food needs to be solidifying their business. And it's been really gratifying and amazing. So if you are a veteran or you know a veteran, get in touch with me and let's get you in. And I am totally dead serious on that pay what you think it's worth. Okay, it's a super amazing value. So with that, I want to talk about our friends' critical control points and critical limits. Okay, so HACCP planning is, of course, hazard analysis for critical control points. Okay, and when we talk about critical control points, we do it for a reason. So way back when, and I'm not going to go back and look at which episodes it was, but way back when we started talking about the 5 pre-steps of food safety planning, one of those pre-steps is drawing out your process flow diagram, right? And we draw out our process flow diagram because we have to know what we are doing, and it's always receive stuff, store stuff, process stuff in whatever way that you do, okay? And then you do packaging and labeling, and you do finished product storage, and you get rid of it. All right, and if it was all that easy, it would be all that easy, but it's not necessarily all that easy, okay? Because when you think about it, that process stuff is how you guys make all your money, okay? But it is also the very most likely place where you are enhancing or controlling for foodborne illness, for hazards, okay? So those physical, chemical, microbial things that can go wrong with the food, okay? And a critical control point is something that, well, controls, right? Like it controls for those foodborne illness, which means that it reduces or eliminates a foodborne illness to a acceptable level, which may be nothing. Okay, so you're not allowed to put, like, whether you write a HACCP plan or not. I want to make this super clear. Whether you write a HACCP plan or not, you are not allowed to put adulterated food into the food stream. Okay, so end full stop. All right, whether or not you are required to do food safety documentation, adulterated food not allowed to go in the food stream. So as long as we're clear on that. Next, just because you think a point in your process flow diagram controls for a hazard doesn't actually mean it does control for a hazard, okay? And so that's what we are diving into today on the podcast, okay? So this is one of those that you're probably going to want to listen to multiple times. Get yourself, hey, one of our handy dandy, and if you want one of these, just let me know. I send these out, okay? So these are our fun Dirigo food safety note-taking, I guess, notebooks, okay? And take notes on this because this can be really confusing, all right? So let's start with what the definition of a critical control point is. It is, and this is a legal definition, guys, any action designed to prevent, reduce to an acceptable level, or eliminate a hazard. All right, and that was the definition created by the National Association for NACMCF, and the MCF is the microbiological criteria of foods. And this is the subset of the really smart people in our government who tell us what things we have to worry about in our foods, okay? So these would be the people that are going to tell us at some point whether or not salmonella is going to be a hazard reasonably likely to occur in beef. And we're going to hope they say no, okay? So a critical control point, all right, is any action. So the action is what's on your process flow diagram, okay? So cooking is an action, and for most people, if you cook, it is designated as a critical control point, okay? We must, by legal definition, especially if you're USDA, all right, but also if you're FDA, if you have a hazard that is reasonably likely to occur, thou shalt control for it. Now, under FDA, we control for it through what they call preventive controls. And under USDA or Fisheries HACCP, which is FDA, we control for it using critical control points, okay? And we only do this if the hazard is reasonably likely to occur, okay? And so for not every hazard is reasonably likely to occur. So if you go back to your hazard analysis and you listed, let's see here, you listed, let's just look at physical hazards because they're easy. You listed, you had boxed beef coming in and you listed metal shards as a hazard you had to consider. All right, I assure you, metal shards are not reasonably likely to occur because it probably never occurred in your facility. And they've never occurred in your facility by virtue of your approved supplier program, right? That's what we covered yesterday in the webinar. So watch the webinar. All right, and so we are. So if your hazard is not reasonably likely to occur, you don't have to control for it. And that's why we have good manufacturing practices, okay? Because good manufacturing practices make hazards not reasonably likely to occur, all right? However, there are hazards that are reasonably likely to occur. And a lot of these look like allergens, okay? A lot of these look like pathogens in our food, salmonella, Shigatoxin E. coli, trichinella, that sort of thing, okay? And those you have to control for because they are reasonably likely to occur, and no good manufacturing practices, all right, can keep them from occurring in your food because NACMCF has told us that they are reasonably likely to occur, all right? If a hazard is reasonably likely to occur, then you have to control for it, all right? And we control for it using preventive controls or critical control points, all right? So when you determine that a hazard is significant and reasonably likely to occur, because remember we talked about hazard significance when we did hazard analysis, then you write a CCP for it, all right? Now, here's the thing though, is that your process flow diagram has 15 different steps or whatever, okay? Those 15 different steps are all there for a reason, but only the ones that are critical are the CCPs. But you still have all the other ones, and we just call those CPs, control points, because you are doing something there, or else it wouldn't be in your process flow diagram, right? So for example, we talk about CPs as things that make a difference in quality as opposed to safety, all right? So, when we are talking about this in a, here's a really good one, okay? The difference between cooling and freezing is quality, not safety, okay? So cold storage is very, very, very infrequently, so not often, is cold storage a critical control point, okay? Cooking is very often a critical control point because if you do that wrong, all sorts of things can happen. And cooling very often is a critical control point because if you do that wrong, Clostridium perfringens is likely to happen, okay? So you can have lots of different points in your process flow diagram, but not all of them are critical control points, all right? So if you go back to your hazard analysis, I want you to remember that all of your significant hazards must be controlled, okay? But they are not necessarily controlled all at the same point, okay? So, and they're not necessarily controlled where they're introduced. So at receiving, unless you're doing fisheries, we never have receiving as a critical control point. Because you can't control for anything at receiving, really. All right. but you're still introducing hazards. So salmonella and trichinosis in pork, those two hazards, if say you are making pork barbecue, those two hazards are controlled for at cooking. So it's one critical control point, cooking, that controls for two different kinds of hazards. That happens all the time in HACCP planning, okay? So I just want you to be able to be flexible in your mind to understand that your critical control points, one critical control point can control for more than one hazard, and hazards can also be controlled for at more than one step. So if you're doing poultry slaughter, for example, so like I'm going to be talking about mobile slaughter in just a minute at office hours. If you're doing poultry slaughter, we control for salmonella and campylobacter at multiple different steps during poultry slaughter. We control for them in the after we wash, like after plucking, all right, and we control for it there. We wash it again before we do carcass chill. We can wash it. We can control for it at if you air dry your carcasses. All of those things help create what we call a multi-hurdle effect for both salmonella and campylobacter. Okay. So those are some examples of the CCPs. So now I want to bring your attention to some critical control point best practices. One of the things that can happen when you're writing a HACCP plan is you can do your steps backwards. Okay. So for example, you, let's see here. You are washing, this actually happened to me, so this is the example I use all the time. Washing chickens, okay, and you've got one of those fancy lines where you have the chickens going around and there's a hose, but you're washing them with water and not acid, okay, just to like remove feathers and all of that sort of stuff because chicken slaughtering is a mess, and you decide that because there's a hose there, it's a critical control point. No, right? That is not true. All right. So be very careful of building your critical control points backwards. Okay. Just because you do something somewhere doesn't actually make it a critical control point. Moving cold carcasses from one place to another and not changing the temperature, very unlikely to create a critical control point. If you are aging cheese, you don't have any critical control points by and large after day 60 because if you're aging raw milk cheese, because after day 60 we consider all those hazards as controlled because that's what the law has told us. Okay, so just be aware that you have lots of different places where you can control things. So let's take labels. All your labels are checked for accuracy. Okay, so say you have allergens in your product. And of course they are, but are you doing something that prevents a hazard that's reasonably likely to occur? And the answer may be yes, and it depends on your own facility. Yeah, okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that we write our critical control points as far downrange as we can, okay? Which is why receiving, never a critical control point, unless you're doing fisheries and they've told you it is, okay? Because the further downrange you make your critical control point, the more likely you are to actually be controlling the hazard there, because hazards can reoccur, right? And if the hazard reoccurs, you never controlled for it to begin with. All right, so that's the next thing to consider. Okay, next I want to think about numbering. We number our critical control points, all right? And it kind of doesn't matter how you do this, but I want you to create a system, all right, and keep it, all right? And so one of the, like, when I'm working with clients, we have HACCP 1, 2, 3, and 4, okay? If we're writing 4 HACCPs. And each HACCP then has critical control points, A, B, C, D, E, F, however many we have. And I want you to be super aware of what we call false cognates. There are a ton of people that got into the habit of having critical control points like 1B, 1C, and those mean bacteria and chemical. But then they'll do things like P, CCP 1P. Okay, well, 1, that's ridiculous to say. And 2, does P stand for physical hazards or does it stand for pathogens. Okay, so just be aware of false cognates. The next thing I want to tell you is your inspection personnel does not get to tell you what your CCP numbering system is any more than they get to tell you within what software you write your HACCP plan. Okay, so as long as you keep things. As long as you keep things so that they are understandable to you and have a numbering system that makes sense, that is truly all you need. All right, so that's critical control points. Now, critical control points all have to be documented, all right? And we document them by virtue of implementing a critical limit, all right? So it's your critical control points really only make sense if you have a critical limit there, okay? So then the question becomes, what is a critical limit? A critical limit is a maximum or a minimum value to which a biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled at a CCP or preventive control to prevent, eliminate, or reduce to an acceptable level the occurrence of that food safety hazard, okay? So it's the measurable things that let you know that you've controlled the hazard, all right? Does that make sense? There are many instances in our food production system for which critical limits are set for you, all right? Some of these look like when you're cooling meat, you can only have a 1 log increase in Clostridium perfringens. Okay. If you are bringing meat up to temperature, it has to be within 4 hours. If you're putting ready to eat food out there, you have to have a 5 log reduction in salmonella. You have to bring, so cheese, this is a great example, 60 days. Raw milk cheese has to be aged for 60 days because we've determined that's a number of days that will reduce the pathogen loads, okay? So there are all sorts of things in all sorts of directives that tell you what your critical limits are. You have to be aware of them. And here is my plea to you, okay? So if you are watching me live on the Proofing Box, this is my plea. If you are going to make nuts for a living, any kinds of nuts, peanuts, I have a ton of people come to me who are doing processing of indigenous nut products. So they're, nuts are how a lot of trees populate, and we can eat a lot of them. And so there are a ton of different kinds of nut products out there. And people come to me and they're like, I want to import and sell roasted nuts. Here's the thing. All roasted nuts have salmonella and shigatoxin E. coli as reasonably likely to occur, because if you look at how these things are recalled, that's what they're recalled for, okay? And the salmonella comes in through cross-contamination of rodents and people, okay? Fecal-oral transmission, rodents and people, because of bad GMPs. And then also a lot of nuts are wild harvested, and birds poop in the woods. I know you needed to tune into a podcast to find that out, but birds do poop in the woods. And salmonella is reasonably likely to occur on all nut products. And friends, that does include coconuts. There's salmonella on the outside of your coconuts. All right. And then there's shigatoxin E. coli has also been implicated because birds can transfer shigatoxin E. coli. And in many places where we have cleared the rainforest and planted cattle in concentrated animal feeding operations, and why, yes, Brazil, I am looking at you. The sheer volume of shigatoxin E. coli blows in the wind and can blow on nut products that are harvested in the rainforest down from concentrated animal feeding operations. All right, so you have to know this, and you have to, in the nut process, it's almost impossible. There's no, I will tell you, there's no such thing as a raw nut, okay? And you have to control for salmonella, and in some cases, shigatoxin E. coli, if it's been demonstrated in your product, and in some nut products it has. What's really difficult is when folks come to me and they've been roasting their nuts and they have quality parameters. I really like it when my nuts are roasted to this level. Okay, nuts are very high in fat, and I get that roasting can create burn, right, and like burn the oils and in your nuts, and then they don't taste as good. But the problem is that if you dry roast nuts, salmonella gets harder and harder to kill. Okay, and so it is really difficult to it's not impossible, but it's difficult to dry roast nuts to a point where you know that the salmonella is dead. Okay, so then the question is what are you going to do about that? And my recommendation, the easiest way forward for most small processors, okay, is to blanch the nuts and then dry roast them, because salmonella dies like that in boiling water. Okay, so, and I mean, it's like that, it's like 2 minutes, but salmonella has a definite kill time in boiling water. Okay, and we can kill, and we have like tables that validate that, because we validated against listeria. All right, and listeria is harder to kill than salmonella in boiling water. And so if you kill listeria, you have killed the salmonella. All right, so boiling water, and then you dry roast them. Okay, or you steam inject during roasting, or you blanch them in oil, which is kind of the same as boiling them in water. All right, I mean, it has flavor differentials, but from a bacteria death point, it's the same thing. Okay, so that is my plea to you, is that if you are out there doing nuts and nut products, please be very, very, very aware of salmonella. And if you have questions, bring them to the Proving Box page so that I can help you before you go marching down the primrose path of death and destruction and you say, hey, Dr. P, I need a HACCP plan. That's impossible to validate because you're cooking your nuts to 120 degrees. Like, that does not, dry roasting nuts to 120 degrees in no way, shape, or form will ever kill salmonella. The end. And if you want to sell your product, you've got to live with that reality. And so a lot of times when we talk about critical limits, people get super upset with me, but a lot of them are dictated to you by the government, okay, or by best practices that the government has adopted, all right? And that's what I got to tell you, all right? So there are some good examples of critical limits. Critical limits are always measurable and implementable and very, very specific. They are things like time and temperature and pH, belt speed, things are on and functioning. They are not things like all employees wash their hands. That is never a critical control point. Average time and temperatures. And then another thing that I find every so often in critical limits is you set a critical limit and it's wrong. All right, so again, that kind of gets back to the nut example. So you can measure it, but you got to measure it correctly. All right, it is incredibly important to know that if you miss a critical limit, by legal definition, your food may be adulterated. You're probably going to have to do rework, all right? And there may be, especially if you're in USDA, regulatory things that you have to go through, all right? So missing a critical limit is a big, fat, hairy deal. And that's why we spend so much time on them, okay? And so you have to be able to evaluate, like if you miss a critical limit, you have to know when you missed it, why you missed it, what's going wrong in your system, and the question that your auditor or your inspector or whatever will ask you is how do you know it wasn't missed at another time, okay? So that's like the bulk of the information about CCP critical limits. You can go out and find these critical limits. Like if you come to the Proving Box, I have a ton of stuff in the files and I can provide critical limits for you. The Code of Federal Regulation will often have critical limits. FDA and FSIS, CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Authority, EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, Hong Kong also has some really good critical limit stuff. Lots of industry associations have really, really good stuff. You can always ask if you are in meat processing. We have a thing called the Niche Meat Processors Assistance Network, and there are a ton of people on there, me included, other HACCP consultants and that sort of thing will help you. And then there are like Facebook groups and stuff like that. I'm on the Salt Cured Pig. You can come here. A bunch of other places that you can look at. Okay. Your critical limits will probably need SOPs, all right, because not everybody is born knowing how to set the belt speed on your piece of equipment. And so you might want to write work instructions or an SOP to help that, to give you the best chance of actually meeting your critical limit, okay? And then we have other types of limits. Okay, so critical limits are the limits at which, like, the salmonella dies, that the, things are filtered so that physical hazards don't get through. However, my urging and my recommendation is that you also have operating limits, okay? And operating limits are tighter tolerances than critical limits, so that you know you're always meeting your critical limits. So for instance, if you're aging raw milk cheese, your critical limit is going to be 60 days for your raw milk cheese, all right? But you may not go in and sell any cheese until it's been aged 62 days, because 62 days is your operating limit. And if you've met your operating limit, you've met your critical limit, okay? Now, there are things to think about with that. I'm not going to lie. It adds operating limits, tighter tolerances, add to inventory cost. They add to how much work you put into a product. So I was talking with a client, and he was beef jerky, and he had to cook his beef jerky in 100% humidity oven to 158 degrees for a minute, as I'm pretty sure what Appendix A says. And he was cooking it to 165. Now, if you're making one batch of beef jerky, who the heck cares? But when you're making batch after batch after batch after batch of beef jerky, that extra time and temperature of that 7 degrees makes kind of a big difference, okay? That's more money and expense in your process, and it reduces your profit margins, okay? So you gotta think about that sort of stuff and figure out what your priority is and how you're gonna balance making money and mitigating risk, all right, which is your job, right, as somebody who is doing your food safety planning. You gotta mitigate the risk, but unless you can also make money at the process, we might as well, pack up and go home, okay? So those are operating limits, okay? You can also have specification limits. Specification limits are limits that your customer tells you, all right? So specification limits are usually quality limits rather than actual safety limits. But it's things like, if you're making hamburgers for somebody, they're probably gonna give you like a diameter and a thickness of the patties. If you're filleting fish, there's a fillet length average that you're gonna have to meet, cheese wheel size, and other things like that. And those are generally kind of more quality driven. All right. So that is the overview of CCPs and critical limits. All right. Thank you so much for joining me for the podcast, and I am going to cut over to office hours now. We're going to be publishing this as a mini-sode, but if you have questions, I want you to come to the proofing box and post questions on the live stream post.